The Australian Financial Review.
Beer is booming in Australia. Not so much the consumption of it, because that's been declining for decades. But perversely, as we started drinking less beer per capita, we became much fussier about the type of beer we wanted. And the result has been an explosion in the number of independent craft breweries and microbreweries in this country. From less than 100 breweries in 2005, the best estimates suggest Australia now has close to 600.
This is fantastic for consumers, it's fantastic for diversity of beer. One thing it's not fantastic for, though, is sustainability, because the smaller you are, generally you don't enjoy the same economies of scale as the big ones. And this is the dirty secret, I guess, of the craft brewing industry, and one that we're increasingly facing up to and finding ways of overcoming.
That's Jon Seltin, and he'd know. Over the past 5 years, he's helped to build one of Australia's fastest growing independent craft brewers from scratch.
Welcome, I'm the head brewer here at Brick Lane Brewing. We're all about making the best beer in the world and not killing the planet in the process.
Can he do it? Let's find out. Everyone knows we need to do something about climate change, but what's not clear is how do we fix it?
Low emissions technologies.
There is net zero modelling.
Change is coming, whether you like it or not.
Change isn't just coming, it's already underway. We're living through a massive industrial revolution where just about everything we do is going to have to change in less than 3 decades. Empires are going to crumble and fortunes are going to be made. I'm Peter Kerr from the Carbon Challenge team at the Australian Financial Review, and this is Tech Zero. It's a podcast about the big green ideas that could get us to net zero and the inspiring people who are putting their heart and soul into making them work. Hey John, thanks for having us out here to the Brick Lane Brewery in Dandenong. It's great to be here. I always say when in Rome, so before we get underway, would you mind?
Absolutely.
Lovely.
Be rude not to.
It would be. So is there carbon dioxide in beer?
Yeah, absolutely there is. And a lot of it's sort of naturally derived. So fermentation, the process by which yeast convert sugars, naturally present in the wort that we make as brewers as they slowly transmute it into beer. There's 2 main byproducts. There's ethanol, the fun stuff, and carbon dioxide, where the bubbles come from. So they're the 2 main metabolic byproducts of yeast.
So I'm looking at this glass of beer that we've just poured, and, the bottom 4/5 of it is beautiful golden liquid. The top is a nice looking froth. Is that the carbon dioxide in the froth at the top?
If you look really closely, you'll see a little string of bubbles rising from the very bottom of the glass or from any little nucleation points or imperfections in the glass, and that's the carbon dioxide. You'll also feel it. It's an important contributor to the mouthfeel and the overall sort of experience of drinking the beer. That fizziness you have on your tongue, it lifts the mouthfeel. It also helps volatilize a lot of the aroma compounds in the beer. Beer without carbon dioxide is a very different experience.
So would beer without carbon dioxide just be flat beer, or would it be a completely different drink?
Well, my English colleagues would just call it beer, I think. That's how they like to drink it over there. But in a lot of other brewing and drinking traditions, the effervescence of the beer, the carbon dioxide is really important to the overall sort of sensory experience. But like the colour of beer or the aroma or the mouthfeel or the body, the level of carbonation also varies widely amongst brewing traditions and amongst different styles of beer.
How much carbon dioxide is released by, one of these 375ml cans of beer?
I know exactly. This is the part where I pull out my calculator, but almost all the beers we make have in the order of 4.9 to say 5.5 grams of CO2 per litre. So this particular can that we're drinking at the moment would have about 1.7 grams of CO2. So that's what will evolve when we open the can, and by the time we've had a couple of burps after drinking this, that's probably what our personal fugitive emissions are going to be by the end of this can.
Now don't worry, we don't want you to feel guilty about the bubbles in your beer. After all, the carbon dioxide released in fermentation was sucked out of the atmosphere by a plant in the first place.
So it's this fairly cyclical process. So you can be drinking it fairly guilt-free, because that 1.7 grams that'll escape over the course of our conversation and thereafter will be absorbed again, theoretically, in the very next barley crop.
So you can drink on, but we might need to change the way we make beer to reduce its carbon footprint. That's where the bigger fish are going to be fried. Brewers like Jon know that there are plenty of things they can be doing to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide, the amount of energy, and the amount of water that they use to make beer. And that's why Jon wanted to show us around his brewery in Dandenong.
Like the king in his castle, the head brewer at Brick Lane has brought us up to this viewing platform, right up high in the corner of the factory here, and as far as the eye can see, there's giant silos and tanks, and down below us there's bags of various grains and commodities, barley and oats and other things. Conveyor belts in the distance, little pipes with steam coming out. Paradise for you, I imagine.
Absolutely, yeah. It's great to show this off. When I see the place, yeah, I'm really proud. I love it. But I also sort of see the energy flows as well. And we planned a lot of the business around this. To our left, we see the brew houses, the sort of the hot block, we call it, the cooking part of the process, where there's a lot of heating requirement and thermal energy used. In front of us, this big farm of these very large 40,000 litre tanks. These are our, what we call the cold block. This is where the fermentation and the maturation of the beer happens. And then right down the end, those conveyors we see down there are the packaging area where we put all the beer into cans and bottles and kegs and send it out to the warehouse next door.
And you helped design this plant from scratch, didn't you?
Yeah, it was a dream gig, this one. And by virtue of doing it as a proper greenfield site, we were afforded a lot of flexibility in how we laid the plant out. And so, we got some real advantages there, and it made some of these sustainability projects, which we have tackled over the past couple of years, a lot more feasible and a lot, let's say, easier to get away than it would have been if it was an older plant or a brownfield site.
Would climate change have changed the way beer tastes already, like over the past decade?
It certainly changes the way it's made and the costs behind it and the way we think about our place in the global ecosystem. In terms of how it tastes, I contend it probably does, right? Because, for example, heritage barley varieties that perhaps, had greater growing ranges in the past, aren't grown as much anymore, in favour of more drought-resistant varieties or higher yielding varieties. Hops, again, there's been a sort of a consolidation of hops and a move to more intensive agribusiness rather than individual small growers. And this necessarily means different raw materials, different flavoured beer. So brewers, you find, think a lot about climate change, right? We think a lot about water stress. We think a lot about changing climatic conditions because it really affects where you can grow these things. And Europe has just come off the back of a terrible crop, mainly because of heat stress. The plants were badly heat stressed this year.
The bubbles released during fermentation are not the only time that carbon dioxide plays a role in the beer making process. Carbon dioxide's actually a crucial tool for brewers in their battle to keep beer fresh while they're making it and packaging it. It's the same for a lot of foods, actually. If you've ever gone to the supermarket and bought those bags of lettuce or baby spinach, well, they're filled with carbon dioxide too. At Brick Lane Brewery, carbon dioxide is particularly useful in the part of the process where a big spinning machine pours beer into dozens of cans simultaneously.
Beer's not like a lot of other beverages. It's very susceptible to damage from oxygen. So we consume a lot of CO2 in the filling process to protect the beer from oxidation. So this is one of our main net consumers of CO2 in our process.
So this thing that's spinning in front of us around in a circle, almost like a carousel, is that where the beer is actually getting put in the can?
Yeah, exactly. Through a complicated set of operations where the can is first flushed with CO2 to remove any air, pressurized to making sure there's no foaming as it fills, filled very accurately to within a couple of millilitres, and then slowly depressurized, again to resist foaming. The ends are then seamed on in this machine we see over to the right, the seamer, again while CO2 is constantly blown under the end as it comes on down and is seamed onto the can. And that's what ensures really nice shelf life of the beer. Like I said, it's a very finicky, annoying beverage, beer. because it's just so susceptible to oxidation and damage during the packaging process.
So this is like the robot version of my local barman, pulling what, about 30 at a time?
Yeah, he does about 15,000 every hour, this one, so 200 and something a minute. Yeah, very accurate barman, this one.
Last year alone, Brick Lane purchased 450,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide in an extremely cold liquid state. Until recently, they were buying that carbon dioxide from the fossil fuel industry.
And is it right that over recent years, a lot of the liquid carbon dioxide that you guys were buying was coming effectively from Bass Strait, where the big oil and gas production zones are?
Yeah, exactly. So along with a lot of my colleagues in the brewing industry, in the medical industry, in other industrial gases, in Victoria, that was one of the main sources here as well. So yeah, it was associated with natural gas mining and quite a large plant there at Lang Lang for Bass Gas.
And is it right that that's changed?
For us, it certainly has. We're a young company, but we're firmly committed to sustainability, and we've started this journey over the past couple of years, and we've made some very big and I'd sort of contend audacious commitments around decarbonisation. And one of the immediate places we looked was at the CO2 that we bring onto site, just considering the volumes that we're using. And we thought there has to be a better way. And indeed there was. So we reviewed what was happening out in the market. We saw a lot of supply uncertainty from some producers with the shutdowns of some of the large ammonia plants in Australia, and with some uncertainty around, say, the future of fossil fuels industry in the country. Long-term uncertainty, I'm talking, not in the short term. And we found a supplier who was doing a little bit differently. So like us, they derive their CO2 from a fermentation process. So in the Shoalhaven in New South Wales, there's one of the largest bioethanol plants in the Southern Hemisphere. Their process is fairly similar to ours in that their feedstock is wheat. They treat it with various enzymes, they ferment it, and they produce ethanol in the process. So they built, on the end of their process, a large CO2 recovery facility that could capture, clean, scrub, liquefy this CO2, and it was a much, for us, greener source because the feedstock or the origin of this was essentially a renewable resource. It was wheat that's grown again each year, and each year it'll fix more carbon during its germination and growth cycle.
So some people might wonder, how is this any better? Because ultimately the carbon's still going into the atmosphere. Why is it better for the environment to get your carbon from a plant rather than from a gas or petroleum producer who's digging it out of the ground?
Yeah, the difference is here we're not adding to the net budget. So for carbon source for or CO2 source from, say, natural gas, that's coming from a sink that's locked in the earth. This is a bit different because it's from a plant that has a relatively short growth cycle. The next, we're releasing this into the atmosphere as we drink the beer and talk today, but the very wheat that this is produced with will grow in the next season's crop as well and fix the same amount of carbon. So it's a lot more cyclical. We're not adding to the net balance of carbon in the atmosphere.
It's one thing to change the source of your carbon dioxide, but there's another big change that Brick Lane have made around the carbon dioxide they purchase. Jon led us over to the big tank where the liquid carbon dioxide is stored.
Prior to using that CO2, we need to change its phase into gas. So we need to vaporise it. And that vaporisation requires energy. And the traditional way of doing this, right, is to use, say, electrically heated vaporizers or steam vaporizers where the liquid CO2, you put energy into the process to warm it up. But this seemed kind of counterintuitive to us and kind of wrong to us as well. And the kind of the light bulb moment was, I guess, when we took a step back and looked at where this plant was. So our bulk CO2 storage tank lives literally next door to our refrigeration plant.
Have you got a mental image of that? Barely 3 metres away from the tank of cold CO2, which needs heating before it can work, there was a refrigeration system which was working overtime to cool things down. That refrigeration system cools a substance called glycol, which Jon's team pipe all the way around the brewery to keep a bunch of things cool. By the time that cold glycol has done a lap of the factory, it's no longer cold. It's been warmed up by all the hot things it's moved past.
And we thought, can we integrate these processes? As that glycol comes back from the field, it's quite warm. And we use that warm glycol to vaporize the CO2. We've installed a big heat exchange that vaporizes the CO2 against that hot glycol.
And so would it be fair to say that this initiative has allowed you to grow without growing emissions, as opposed to reducing emissions?
No, in fact, it goes further than that. So it is the case that we didn't need to install, for example, a piece of equipment to do this vaporization for us. But in fact, it's reduced our emissions in that it's reduced the refrigeration demand for the site in a material way. So it hasn't halved it, but we use a lot of CO2 here, and it's very, very cold. It's at about minus 70 degrees. So you can imagine it does a lot of work in pre-cooling our glycol, and it means our refrigeration plant doesn't have to work nearly as hard. Essentially, we're getting back all that energy that our CO2 producer used on their side in compressing and cooling the CO2. We're recovering that into our side. And yeah, not just avoiding or negating the need to put energy in, but we're also saving refrigeration energy at the same time. So it's a net reduction for us. And we think it's saved us in the past 12 months about 32 tonnes of CO2 emission equivalents, and we believe that's just going to increase year on year as we consume more and more CO2 as our production continues to grow.
And did it save you dollars as well?
Yeah, it did, yeah. So again, only a modicum. We're talking tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, but it's still a demonstrable saving for us. So the payback on the project was just over 12 months.
Now, David Boone famously got through more than 40 beers on a flight from Australia to England, so I'm going to try and get through 2 beers in an episode of Tech Zero, so pardon me.
Let me join you.
Yeah, it's work, so I have to.
Exactly, it's quality control. It's an important part of the job.
Exactly. If some of our listeners to Tech Zero want to try and reduce the carbon intensity of the beer they choose, what would your advice be? Is a stout more carbon intensive than a lager or a pale ale?
I think a couple of the biggest positive influences that your listeners could make is drinking local. So drinking beer that is produced here in Australia largely from Australian ingredients, right? So they then negate the need for importing, for bringing beer, which is incredibly heavy and bulky around the world, all the shipping and energy encompassed therein. And 2, by thinking about the format in which they drink their beers. So cans, for example, are particularly energy efficient. We chose aluminium as our primary packaging format for a couple of reasons. 1, it's what consumers are screaming for in Australia for a whole range of reasons. 2, there's some real logistics advantages to using it, which reduce carbon emissions associated with the transport of aluminium, the cooling of it as well. And 3, because of the recycled content in the feedstock as well. So we make sure that we understand our suppliers' business as well. We're a much smaller customer than, say, Coca-Cola, but we do have great conversations with suppliers around what they're doing around decarbonisation and what they're doing around, say, circular economies, particularly around reuse. And the cans we use are, at the moment, about 60% recycled content. Energy neutral, carbon neutral cans as well is something we would be very interested in.
What if I told you that you could now get a carbon-free aluminium can to put your beer in? Would that be something that would appeal to you guys?
Yeah, absolutely.
Luckily for John, I know a bloke who might be able to help him get his hands on carbon-free beer cans. And we'll meet him after the break. I'm joined now in the studio by Mark Davies of Rio Tinto. And Mark, I'd love to get into my 3rd can of this episode, so are you up for a drink?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. So, we're drinking out of cans today. Are we any chance of seeing a low-carbon beer can anytime in the future?
Funnily, you should ask. We've actually already produced, in partnership in Canada, about 1.2 million low-carbon beer cans. And really interestingly, they're tracked. We have a QR code, and consumers can track the life cycle of that aluminium to demonstrate that it's low carbon.
On the white sandy beaches of Mexico, there's only one beer for us.
Those 1.2 million cans hit the market in June, and they were filled with the Mexican beer Corona.
Corona Extra, the only cerveza for us.
So if I were in Canada today, could I go down to a bottle shop and buy one of these new Corona beer cans made with your product?
You absolutely could. And when you got there, you could scan the QR code on the front and it would actually show you the history of that material from the mine, the bauxite, how it was processed into alumina and how it was processed into aluminium.
So there might be right now, as we speak, someone in Montreal or Ontario scanning their beer can and seeing that it was originally comes from Cape York Peninsula up at Weipa, where you guys dig up red gravel we call bauxite.
Yep, absolutely.
Are we now just on a pathway to those becoming mainstream, and our listeners might expect to see zero carbon cans in their shop sometime later this year or next year, or is there some further steps to go?
It's going to take us a few years. The 1.2 million cans was using aluminium produced from our pilot facility, and we need to scale that facility up, lift it to bigger cells, higher amperage, and we are working to have that done by the end of next year. And then we're actually going to have to build factories. So, the core of the technology absolutely works. It's really the scale up and commercial aspects of doing that in an economically viable and an economically attractive way.
This all happened in Canada because that's where Rio and its rival aluminium producer Alcoa have been working on ELYSIS. That's a process which could remove the hard-to-abate emissions from the aluminium smelting industry. So lots of people might think that if you can make the power for a aluminium smelter renewable, such as you guys have in Canada with big hydroelectricity plants, that you can make aluminium carbon-free. Is that right, or is there more to it?
There is more to it. Aluminium does use a lot of electricity. And today, most of the world's aluminium is produced in China. And when it's produced in China with coal-fired electricity, it's about 18 tonnes of CO2 per tonne of aluminium. In Canada, where we are very fortunate to have large hydroelectricity supplies with zero carbon electricity, it's still about 2 tonnes of carbon dioxide per tonne of aluminium because you're consuming a carbon anode and that releases CO2. Now, we've worked in partnership with Alcoa, the government of Quebec and Apple to produce a zero carbon anode which releases oxygen rather than CO2, and that produces zero carbon aluminium.
And beer cans are a great way to get the attention of buff heads like me, but is this low carbon aluminium going into anything else?
So yeah, absolutely. So I think you'll find your if you happen to have some Apple products, there's a fair bit of zero carbon aluminium in some of the high end MacBooks.
So it seems like we're on our way to having carbon free aluminium cans, but can brewers like Jon hold up their end of the bargain by filling those cans with carbon-free beer? Can you imagine a day where we have carbon-neutral beer? Or is it always going to be in there?
No, I can, actually. And I think this is the thing that keeps me excited about the brewing industry. We operate in a really interesting temperature and energy balance in breweries. There's lots of opportunities for reduction to begin with, through, say, raw materials innovation and process innovation. But then there's also a really sort of favourable temperature and energy mix for renewables as well. So our process isn't a particularly hot one. It might be much more difficult for our colleagues in the steel industry or aluminium industry, for example. But in breweries, we operate in this temperature range where emerging technologies like solar thermal, like heat pumps, like electrification projects can really start to fill the gaps that are going to be created as we decarbonise and as we move away from fossil fuels. The next step for me, though, is how we're going to get away from burning natural gas to do this job. And that, I think, is going to be one of the bigger challenges for decarbonisation in the brewing industry, but not an insurmountable one. And that's the next phase that we're squarely focused on.
The biggest thing that would need to change to create a carbon-free beer would be the stage of the process where a liquid called wort gets boiled. The process requires giant kettles full of the stuff to be brought to boil extremely quickly.
There's a crucial part of the hot side of our process, where we have to take each batch of beer, so 10,000 litres, up to boiling temperatures and drive off quite an amount of steam to remove some of the volatile, unpleasant flavours and aromas out of the beer. And you can imagine the thermal energy required to do this is monumental. We've got to look at ways of decarbonising that thermal energy requirement. It's a real challenge in the Australian energy market. So this is the sort of a goal we've set ourselves over the next 3 years, to work out a way to get off our addiction to natural gas.
The answers aren't yet clear. John's got high hopes that a solar thermal solution could help wean his brewery off methane gas, and hydrogen might also be the answer. Either way, he's determined to find something that can cut emissions even further.
I'm really proud to be part of this community of brewers who are squarely focused on sustainability, as well as doing interesting things with the beer, doing it in an interesting and in a responsible way. So there are now a handful of us who have got B Corp accreditation. This is new news for us. This has been a sort of a year-long journey for us. It's an ethical supply chain accreditation and looks not just at our environmental sustainability, but at our entire sort of supply chain and some of our community projects as well. So I think about some of my larger colleagues around the country at breweries like Four Pines and Stone and Wood and Capital in Canberra who have this same accreditation. I'm proud that we've got this, feels like we've got this critical mass now, and that sustainability is well and truly no longer the dirty little secret that craft brewers don't talk about, but something that's being actively attacked and actively pursued.
Thanks for listening to Tech Zero. Join us next week when we meet the Queenslander who's on his way to becoming the Elon Musk of the skies. This podcast was hosted and written by me, Peter Kerr. It was produced and edited by Lap Fan, with technical production by Cormac Lally and Margaret Gordon. And it was executively produced by Fiona Buffini. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And consider rating and reviewing, as it helps us find other listeners. At the Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business, and power. You can subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. And if you want to drop us a line here at Tech Zero, we've got our own email address, techzero@afr.com. The Tech Zero podcast is part of the Financial Review's Carbon Challenge franchise.
The Australian Financial Review.